So, Joe, how did you get into producing comics?
I've always been obsessed with comics and reading comics and creating comics when I was a kid. I think I can remember the first comic I bought. It was like this life-changing experience. It was at this variety store, and I went in and bought this Spider-Man, and I was obsessed ever more. I can remember the exact issue. And I've always been into them. And then I went through a phase of superhero comics for years, obsessively, like spending every cent I had on them. And then I lost interest in them because they didn't, as I matured and I was reading other, proper works of fiction, and they didn't have that depth of characterization or whatever. And I got bored with the superhero stuff, and I would left comics behind, and I was still drawing stuff, but I was more like trying to be an artist, like paintings and such. And I was terrible at paintings and stuff. I was not a real artist. And then I moved to. It was in the '80s when the indie comics wave started. Like people like Dan Clowes with 8 Ball and the Hernandez brothers and
they're still around.
They're all still around. They're like they're at the top of their game, really. These guys. And Linda Barry's another at the time, and Julie Doucette, and who else? Well, those were the Chris Ware started out doing Acme Novelty Library, and so it was like these sort of genre-defying comics. They were like literature. They were deep, and there was so much possibility in them. The art was beautiful
and self-referential, right?
Yeah,
like Barry's stuff is very much about her.
Yeah, so much about her childhood and her memories of it, and it's so vividly as good as any book. Right. I mean, we have in comics we're very we always were very self-denigrating, like it's because it's kind of a gutter art form, so we tend to mock the form, but there's such, you can really do amazing things with the form. You can do things with comics, I think, that you can't do with anything else except maybe film. Yeah.
So when you first got back into drawing and you were influenced by those folks, what were the first things you created?
Well, when I started doing it, I wasn't doing proper comics. I was doing like hybrids of like illustrated fiction and weird poetry, amalgams, and sort of hybrids. I was doing these little.
So these were more like zines.
These were zines, yeah. So it was like, but my zines were like, they were glued and they had little spines. Yeah. So I did them all by hand in this really weird, primitive, gluing press that I had, and people were always amazed by those. And I used to sell thousands of those. I'd reprint them, and it was the spine that attracted people.
So where did you get the inspiration for those little books?
Well, I was working in a machine shop. I was like a factory worker, and we used to wrap the cylinders that we would grind in newspapers, and the boss would subscribe to the Globe and Mail to wrap them, and so that's how I would read the Globe and Mail while I was operating machines, and it was kind of like part of my education. But one of them was like about the Small Press Book Fair in Toronto, which was held at the U of T, and it was mostly poetry and little zines and poetry books and that. And the only thing that I was interested in when I went there was Gary Barwin's stuff, and Gary Barwin's now nominated for the Governor General's Award and the Giller, but he was an institution in that zine scene, but his stuff was illustrated, and it was tiny little books, and that's what interested me, the tininess of the form.
And what year was that?
Oh, that's like 82, 83. And so I came home and started, consciously making stuff to put in those little books. And then I published them and printed them. And by that time I was working by the time I actually was printing them, I worked in a printing factory, so I would use all their facilities at night and rip off the boss by printing these things and binding them and everything. And And so, but I printed them and bound them, and then never did anything with them. I had boxes full of these books that I didn't sell anywhere because I was too shy to show them to anyone. And eventually, I took them around to stores and started selling them.
So that was very much of a sort of DIY approach to publishing, right?
Yeah, and there still is that. I mean, I did that for years. I self-published in the '80s. There was a big self-publishing movement in indie comics, and people were, it was they call it the black and white boom, because it was like everyone was self-publishing black and white, comics with a 2-color cover, and it was cheap to do, and the distribution resources were there to distribute them for a small press. So I did 3 issues of a terrible science fiction comic, and lost so much money, just thousands of dollars with the shipping charges and the border, brokerage fees and all that. Oh, it was terrible. So I realized I didn't want to be a publisher. I just liked doing the work, and then I spent years. I had a weekly strip in the Hamilton Spectator back in the '90s, and that was for 5 years. So that weekly strip takes a lot of your energy, and I didn't have time to do longer pieces outside of the weekly strip. I did a few little things, but no long form comics really. And then I had another strip in Exclaim, which was the big entertainment monthly, I guess. Hi, Kat. And that was also for 5 years, and it was I didn't really have. I spent 10 years doing newspaper comics and not really anything else. And when those both dried up, and I was fired from both of those, that's when I was I really wanted to get back into drawing comics, like straight comics, and that's when I started drawing comics. And I at the same time was approached by a publisher because graphic novels, that term graphic novels, would just come around, and publishers were interested in that, and they wanted to publish graphic novels. So I was approached by a publisher. I said, oh yeah, sure, I can get together a book. They looked at my stuff and they liked it, and then I had 7 months to put together a whole book. So I wrote and drew like a 150-page book in 7 months, which was a big undertaking, because it's time consuming. Drawing comics is incredibly time consuming.
So a lot of your stuff is very biographical, autobiographical, and very observational. Is that common to the sort of graphic novel scene, or?
Yeah, it's common. It's common in the kinds that I like. Where it's. I don't like fantasy so much. I like real life. I'm interested in the kitchen sink kind of stuff. That's what interests me. So that's what I'm drawn to read, and it's what I'm drawn to make myself. That's what I'm drawn to in everything I like in film and in everything. So
you're almost like Diane Arbus, in some ways, right? A very fringe, very sort of edge of circus freaks, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And your work is always that kind of dark edge stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think that's cartoonists are weird. They're kind of like weird, awkward hermit people generally. They're not the most socially adept people, cartoonists. A lot of cartoonists hang out together. There are a lot of good-hearted weirdos. So I guess that's why they would be attracted to that kind of character, because they probably are that kind of character.
So when I read your stuff, especially year after year, I think, man, you must be going to a dark place, because it's all so dark, right?
Yeah. Well, my first 2 books were done when I was in the middle of getting divorced, and then the aftermath of a divorce, because I got married when I was young, and I was married for got married when I was 17. I was married for 18 years the first time, and it all ended very acrimoniously and horribly, and it was dark. And I was a bit of a drunk for many years, and I haven't touched booze in 3 years, but I was in some dark places, and I had moved to Montreal. I was in a new relationship, and it was great, except that I was still kind of traumatized from my previous one, and so a lot of the when you're, it's not. I don't want to make it that great art comes from suffering, because I don't think it has to, but sometimes it does, and I think I was wondering recently when I'd quit drinking, I was wondering if I'd become boring and I'm too happy to make like good stuff anymore, because I finished a book and I was like, I was dead. I didn't have anything. I had no ideas. Nothing was coming to me, but it just took time. But when you're in a weird, dark place, you know that tends to be what comes. The work that comes out of it reflects that. So, yeah.
So, you know, F. Scott Fitzgerald was famous for seeing stuff, writing down great lines of dialogue that he heard, just found conversations and stuff. And I get a sense that you must do that, at least in your head, right?
I do that all the time. I mean, I have notebooks all over the place, and I'm jotting things down. The thing with me now is I work at home. I work in a part-time in a bookstore, but mostly I'm at home, and I'm in my office here in my basement dungeon, and I work constantly. When I'm in the middle of a book, I'll work, 15 hours a day. Well, the thing is, I don't get out much, so I don't see people as much as I used to. Living in Hamilton, which is even more so in the past, had such a cast of weirdos. This city is it's like prime real estate for a cartoonist, because there's just so much amazing, bizarre humanity here.
Yeah, there's an old line about the Barton bus, so much entertainment for $2.55.
Exactly, yeah. That's it. And if you ride around on the bus here or just walk around, you're gonna have, that's a kind of an exercise I would do sometimes, just go for a walk and try and make like a comic out of the end of that. Like me, I love that kind of honesty in fiction or anything, or a documentary or anything. I mean, it appeals to me. The quote, I used it as a quote in one of my books, and it's like, it feels like one of the things that means the most to me, one of the most important quotes is that poet, Roman poet Terence, and it's like, I am a man, and I hold that nothing human is alien to me. And I think that's really, to me, like I'll talk to anybody about anything. I don't shy away from the truth about things. I'm a kind of person that'll talk about anything with anyone, and I think that I try and bring that into my work, just to be honest and open about things.